Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Cornelis Schilt, lecturer and researcher in the Center for Logic and Philosophy of Science at the Free University in Brussels. He is the author of Isaac Newton and the Study of Chronology, Prophecy, History, and Method from Amsterdam University Press. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Schilt at the Edmund Burke Foundation's National Conservatism Conference in Miami, and I'm delighted to carry on that conversation today. Dr. Schilt, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I am very excited to be able to have a transcontinental conversation. It's somehow just really exciting to think about the fact that we can enact our own little republic of letters here across the pond and talk about science today. Well, Dr. Schilt, I wanted to start with asking you about a note on your card. Your card lists your job as a historian of knowledge. What does that mean, and why should we pay attention to the historical context of knowledge?
What is a historian of knowledge? Well, what does it mean that we know things, and how do we know what we know? People throughout history have always been wondering, how can we know things? How can we know things about ourselves? How can we know things about the universe? What does it mean to have something like science, which literally means knowledge, scientiae? How is knowledge about God different from knowledge about nature? And in order to understand how we arrived at where we are now, all the knowledge that we have now is quite helpful to see the trajectory of how people have been struggling with similar questions. So my field incorporates the history of science, the history of scholarship, the history of religion, the history of working with artifacts, basically all human endeavors where we try to understand and make sense of the world in and around us.
I want to kind of press into that just a little bit. Those seem like three different ways that people pursue knowledge. Science is kind of, at least I think of science as being particularly focused on material causality and maybe at the grandest and the most minute levels. Philosophy is sort of an intellectual exploration that's less interested in proof and more interested in the strength of arguments, it seems. And religion depends primarily on a prior assumption that there is some spiritual reality that has somehow spoken or revealed itself to those of us here on the material plane. Those seem like three separate things, and yet you just told us they really belong together. Help me see the connection between those three. Like, why do you see those as all really having a lot of overlap?
This is exactly where history of the field comes into being, because that tripartite division that you just made is really something very modern. If you'd ask someone in the 17th century about these things, they would say that they're all intrinsically connected. It's exactly in the 17th century that people began to distinguish between these fields, if you like. But to give you an idea, people like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, all the greats in history of science, wouldn't have considered themselves scientists. They would have considered themselves natural philosophers. That was the term in use, and it encompassed quite a bit more than what we would now call science. There was a very strong religious dimension by definition. And a term like cosmology, for instance, which we now use, to describe the study of the skies, of the heavens, if you like, that incorporate the relation between God, mankind, and the universe in its totality. So words have also changed, and terms have changed throughout the centuries, and that division, if you like, into science, philosophy, and religion. You could question how useful that actually is and how true that actually is. I suppose it depends on your worldview.
And I'm sure that's true. I know I taught a high school philosophy class for 3 years, and there is a very thin line between Plato's theory of forms and sort of a doctrine of God. They are distinct. I did finish that class and think, okay, those are different things, but they're a lot closer than I thought than I used to think of them as. And I really, it seems like philosophy and theology really are sisters more than they are distant strangers in a way. You used the phrase
Mhm.
natural philosophy. Before we move back on to our schedule question, I did want to just ask you about one other figure from that time period. Uh, this is going way back when I was an undergraduate history major. My professor handed me a biography of John Dee, and he seems to fit everything you're describing. He was the court astrologer to Elizabeth I for a time, but like many people in her court, he fell out of favor. So he started traveling across Europe, and his passion was uncover. It was he had two passions. He wanted to uncover the philosopher's stone, and he did lots of experiments claiming that he would find the philosopher's stone. But he also really wanted to discover the angelic language that was spoken in the Garden of Eden. So his journals are some of the most interesting things that are filled with cryptic nonsense that I at least would say it's cryptic nonsense. He said that he would trapped a demon in a circle and made it talk to him, and he wrote down what it said. So and he was one of the folks I remember, like he used alchemy and chemistry and magic and science almost interchangeably in a way that no one today would use those terms in the same way. But he thought
Yeah.
they were really identical. What are your thoughts on John Dee or that whole era? Kind of just what are your thoughts in response to that story?
John Dee is a fascinating figure because he's slightly before what we would now call the scientific revolution, which, if you like, doesn't really start with Copernicus, but more with Galileo and Kepler in the early 17th century. When John Dee talked about magic, it's not the same as, Harry Potter style waving your wand. Magic was the manipulation of nature. And that again sounds very scientific, if you like to use the modern word science. Just like alchemy, you could see it as a form of early chemistry. They even used a term in those days called chemistry, which is chemistry with a Y instead of an E, to describe what we would now call a sort of, well, both true chemistry and a bit of the ideas that there is a spiritual dimension there, that indeed there is this thing called the transmutation of metals, which was what the philosopher's stone was supposed to do. It could create anything or it could turn any base metal into gold. And it has been one of the two sort of hallmarks of alchemy ever since the 14th century, when the field emerges. One of them, the other one being the elixir of life.
Hmm.
So, having riches and eternal life, I suppose not much has changed over 7 centuries. So.
I'm sure that's true. Those have been the most potent temptations for humanity since the dawn of time, and I'm sure that won't change. Well, let's talk a little bit about Sir Isaac Newton. I know that that's been a major focus of your academic work. I'm going to mention the title of your book one more time. That is Isaac Newton and the Study of Chronology, Prophecy, History, and Method. How would you describe Sir Isaac's contributions to modern science?
Foundational. No, there would not be modern science without Isaac Newton, to put it that way. He is the first one to rigorously apply mathematics to nature. And instead of saying, I'm going to give you a theory that describes everything, that gives an explanation for everything, he'd say, I can't do that, but I can give you a method that will get you very close. And it's based upon empirical measurements and verification thereof, and mathematical theories. So induction and deduction, if you like. Those terms are not Newton's, but he's the one who rigorously applies those. And through this sort of method, he also comes up with theories about gravity that we still have, mathematical theories about gravity. So you have to think in the early 17th century. So the 17th century can be characterized by this whole idea. So that natural philosophy talks about everything. It talks about causes all the way from God until the simple causes that we see. And a natural philosopher like Kepler, like Galileo, like Descartes, ideally wanted to give a full theory that encompassed all these notions. And the last one to do so is this Frenchman called René Descartes, and he comes up with a theory that literally says that it explains everything. But as Newton would say, well, a theory that explains everything explains nothing, because you have nothing to verify the theory with, because that's already incorporated in the theory. Then how do you know that the theory has any truth value? You don't. So Newton, in a sense, he wants to have a theory that encompasses both the universe, God, and mankind, but he's also very rigorously involved in the development of a method that gives you accurate knowledge. With Newton, we have the beginnings of the scientific method as we know it now. And later on, I will tell you that there is no such thing as the scientific method, but let's call it scientific methodology, and that can be replicated, and that is mathematically rigorous.
Let's go there for a moment, because I'm thinking I teach at a school where we have grades 6 through 12 have different science classes. They go through various iterations of kind of a geology, biology, chemistry, and physics at different middle school and high school levels. And every one of those classes begins with a standard that is always called the scientific method. And it always depends on who's teaching the class, of course, but ideally, every year we have our students kind of begin with what we teach them is this kind of standard 5 or 6-fold scientific method that involves identify a problem, develop a hypothesis, develop a testable mechanism, actually experiment, and then evaluate your results, and then publish your results, I think is the standard last key. So tell us more about when you say there is no scientific method. I really want to know more, because that's certainly something that we tell people that there is. So why do you say there is no scientific method?
Maybe you could argue that the method that you've just described is an ideal that good science should adhere to. And then in practice, no one actually does science that way. It's a bit like the biblical law, the 10 Commandments being read out, and then everyone thinking, oops. What was your score this week? Well, it wasn't so good, but we should all strive to it. So generally speaking, scientists try to follow that method, but it's never as rigorously applied as the letter of the law, if you like, because science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Science does not happen on its own. If for one, there is the person of the scientist with its own motives, which could be, the next career step, or I want to be famous, so I fake it, or there is an agenda that I want to pursue for all sorts of reasons, or that I'm forced to pursue. You see, that there's nothing neutral about science, even though many scientists think that what they do is very neutral, and they are actually quite what's the word I'm looking for? Integer. I mean, they are not crooks,
That is, I think that's fascinating, because it's reminding me of a class I took where I had to read Watson and Crick's book, The Double Helix, about the discovery of the DNA model. And it was, I was surprised. I'm a humanities guy through and through. I was not happy about taking a pseudoscience course. We weren't doing science. We were reading about science, which I also learned are two very different things in that class. But we had to read this book. And one of the things that struck my fancy in that book was that they are just, I think it's Watson in particular, these guys are just bumbling around in labs, and they are paying very close attention to the prestige of their opponents. And they're really, really concerned about being the first ones to publish. And then they're really, at one point, they are mildly depressed that someone else published, but then they're really excited because they spot the mistake in his research. And now they're like, oh, there's still a chance. We can still get there. And it's not this idyllic rush to truth. It's much more exactly what you're just saying. It's the career move. It's the prestige. It's the acclaim. It's much more human than I at least was thinking of the stereotypical scientist in his lab who is just pursuing knowledge and truth for their own sake. No, that's not what these guys are. There's all the finances of that story too, because they each got funding for a certain amount of time and had to have some level of results in order to get additional funding in the future, which created all these incentives. It was not this unmixed, unadulterated scientific story that I was kind of expecting.
Or Alternatively, you should argue that science, as we usually see it, is way too narrow. This is also science. Now you have to realize that the double helix was written. Um, think this is their story. This is also the way they want to tell the world about it. So it's biased by definition, and at the same time, it gives you this insight. Now, tell me, where in the double helix did you see the two, or if you like, three main protagonists, including Rosamund Franklin, follow anything remotely related to that scientific method that you just described?
They
It's not.
really
It's not
don't.
there. It's not there. It doesn't. The word scientific method isn't even included in the book.
Mm.
So this isn't a nice case study about how science works in real life. Any budding scientist, you've done your master's degree, you want to obtain, you want to move on, you want to have a career. That means that you need to find funding, a funded lab space, so you have to go with the agenda of the lab, which means you have to work on a project that's often not your own project, and you have to do it in a certain way that's not the way you might want to do it. But if you want to go an independent course right away, you won't succeed, because there's a power dynamic here. I hate using that word, but because I'm not a commie, but it is true. There are in every line of profession, this is the case. So you have to reach a certain academic maturity first, which often means getting your PhD, getting a lot of publications out, because that's how your success is being measured. That gives you the next postdoctoral position, that gives you the next postdoctoral position. In the meantime, you travel all over the world, so forget about family life or friendships or that sort of stuff. It's all very shallow if it's there. Or you have to limit yourself incredibly and maybe give up on a career straight away, or a long career, if you like, in academia. So how far are you willing to go? And then you see someone doing something that's unethical, but it's also your postdoc supervisor. So are you ratting him? Or are you willing to play along, because you can see that it will promote your career? Then someone offers you a couple of million to do research on something that looks a bit shady, but it is a couple of million, and it's a grant that you can put on your CV. And all of these things happen, and that's the scientist's life.
There's something what everything you're describing makes perfect sense. It's taking me back to days studying history and realizing there's a reason most historians are very, very sarcastic people. The historical study tends, I think, to produce a little bit of cynicism, because the more you dig into the complexity of people, the more you realize that odds are really good that nobody is as good in reality as they make themselves look in print. And the historian's task is to dig into that complexity. And somehow science manages to present itself with this pristine image. And I don't know if those are actual scientists who contribute to that, or if it's something that people just imagine. But I wonder if we could use that to kind of bridge between the distinction between there's science on the one hand, that maybe if we take everything we've been describing, this messy, convoluted mix of ideas, power dynamics, tradition, innovation, and somehow producing some new insight into some long traveled path of knowledge. But then there's scientism on the other hand, where there's somehow this idyllic mentality of like, oh, the science has said, the science has concluded, the science is clear. And so how should we distinguish between those two? What would you add to kind of clarify those terms? What are your thoughts on those two terms?
Well, before we go into scientism full blown, I think there is a third avenue or a third field that is very important here, and it's called science communication. Because in between the lab and you sitting behind your screen or reading your journal or your newspaper, there is someone who reports on science, and they are science journalists or science editors or science writers. They can be from independent critical media, of which less and less exist, of course. They can be from industry themselves or from the labs themselves. Some really want to make something that's very difficult simple to understand so we can all grasp it, and others just want to promote a particular idea of what science is, and those people are not to be underestimated. The thing is that these days large news corporations want to pay less and less for educated science journalists, so science journalists who come from a field of science, who understand the complexities of science, and then also are able to write about this in such a way that it forms a very interesting and still factual, correct story. So a lot of science communication is dumbing down on the complexities of what science is, and it tries to play into an existing narrative, the simple narrative. The scientists are robots that follow the scientific method, and thereby all their results are sort of objective truths and that sort of thing. Um, so that's one thing that I wanted to inject into this conversation. Now, scientism is something that is actually quite difficult to define. There are at least three different definitions of scientism, but I think the one that you're hinting at is the idea that science can teach us everything and is the only and true method to ultimate knowledge. Um, that is the one that's been promoted by Richard Dawkins, for example, or by Steven Weinberg, or by various other scientists, some with very, very, very rich careers, who believe that their science is somehow better than everything else. They religiously believe that. And that's because to them, science has become a religion. Because there's nothing in science itself that warrants any of these statements about science itself. Science is a model with which we look at the world and try to make sense of it and try to come up with new ideas, new facts, new data, new discoveries. But any decent scientist will tell you that it cannot be complete by definition. It's exactly what Newton already did. It's exactly what Einstein said. It's exactly what many other scientists will tell you. If you ask an atheist scientist about the existence of God, the only truly scientific answer would be, we don't know, or I don't know and I cannot know because my method will not allow me to say something about it. Therefore, with regards to God, I am agnostic. That's the only properly scientific response. Of course, many will say, I don't believe in God and there can't be a God. And this already borders on scientism, because now they apply their method to a field to which their method isn't suitable. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, because history of science is often used by the adherents of scientism to show that theirs is a success story that will eventually explain everything. It's inevitable. In the olden days, God was invented to cover all the gaps in our knowledge. It's literally called the God of the gaps. And more of these gaps have been filled in by science. And so in the future, whatever gaps we still have will be filled in by science. That's sort of an extrapolation of their method. Again, there's something lacking from this line of reasoning, namely proper evidence, which is unhelpful when you claim that science is your religion if you don't have the evidence that goes with that religion, So I'm very skeptical whenever I hear someone use this mode of reasoning, and I'm thinking, that's all good for you, but it doesn't work if you follow your own rules.
I'll go back to something you said a moment ago about science as a particular model for trying to understand the universe, or particularly whatever it is the scientist is studying. And if it's a model, it makes sense that model is useful for a particular purpose. And that's not to denigrate the scientific model for what it is, but it is to appreciate it for what it is and recognize that that's not the totality of what exists. Is that an accurate statement?
That's very accurate, and I'm very glad that you also point at the positives, if you like, because just the fact that we can have this transgalactic conversation is because of science. The fact that you and I are healthy and thriving and have a life expectancy of, what's it, 79 years old on average, is
Sure.
because of modern science,
Mhm.
and many more of these things, because there is also a group of people who would easily discard the fact, oh, science, it's just a bunch of theories, it's just one particular model. No, it has been extremely successful.
Mhm.
And maybe that's exactly what then leads to this idea that science will eventually explain everything. A sort of very cocky optimism.
Which maybe to bring in a philosophical construct recalls Aristotle's doctrine of the mean that the right response is almost always a moderate response, whether that's in action or in thought. And there is some sort of flaw that lies in deficiency and some sort of flaw that lies in excess. So
Hmm.
a complete skepticism about science is really going to be that deficient area, and an overconfidence in science to tell us more than it's capable of is going to be that excessive flaw. But a right appreciation of science, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it has given us the ability to overcome a lot of conditions of in reality. I mean, we can transcend distance in a way that our ancestors could not. We can overcome diseases through a much more accurate understanding of chemistry and biology. We can understand ourselves to some extent to a great deal more. That each of those gains that science seems to offer, it seems like there's a tantalizing thought that, like, oh well, if we've discovered this, there's a temptation to then say, well, what have we not discovered, rather
Mm.
than being content with what is discovered and really mapping that out. There it seems to me that there's something really interesting about the growth of science as a model and its spread throughout different disciplines and different industries that also pairs with an intellectual progressivism, not just its political application, but just the intellectual belief in progress, that human growth is infinite and technological progress is infinite. Well, therefore, scientific knowledge must also be infinite, which also
Yeah,
seems to minimize the importance of a particular discovery because that particular discovery is only ever one stepping stone to the infinite.
that's quite well, beautifully phrased, actually. But you use the word progress, and I always find it very interesting that in the late 19th century, this is the historian of science speaking again. In the late 19th century, there was this idea that we knew everything, and there was an ultimate belief that everything progressed towards perfection, including science and society and human understanding. And now we had a theory of evolution that even was a scientific narrative of how we came to be. And then what you see in the West, which the enlightened West, of course, had removed Christianity from its worldview, but there is a longing, there is a void apparently, and suddenly you see an interest pop up in Buddhism and Hinduism and other Asian religions and African religions even. Apparently, there's something missing, something is lacking, and so the word progress. I always want to be a bit careful about that, because haven't we traded something, as in a devil's bargain, a la Faust? We sold our soul for eternal life. I mean, look at people these days. I just talked about our average life expectancy. We seem to do everything to prolong our lives. Even when we are 84 years old and cancer is being diagnosed, we are willing to undergo the most horrendous chemotherapy to prolong that life with maybe another 6 months. Is it worth it? It's incredibly expensive, but also why this need to prolong this life to its ultimate?
Mhm.
Um, there is something to be said about living a fulfilled life and living a life full of quality, which need not necessarily be very long, if you like. So the spiritual dimension is often neglected, of course, by science.
Mm-hmm.
But as human beings, apparently we are both matter and spirit.
And both of those matter. And I'm thinking as you were describing that, and at least there's a thought I've been toying with for several months, and I'm still working out. So there are probably holes in this logic, but there's a line in C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength where he talks about the creatures who live on the dark side of the moon. That's his the closing novel of the Ransom trilogy. It's his Lewis's best exploration of science fiction. But he talks about the creatures on the dark side of the moon having made a dark bargain where they traded away their children, and they
Mm.
lose the ability to reproduce, and they gain a lot of material wealth for that. And it's sort of a throwaway line that I wish Lewis had expanded on. I would love to like get a dystopian novel set in that society. But it seems to me that there is something to that idea. I think there's that too. If I was gonna look at that idea of progress at a I think of my work in teaching as often a daily battle against cultural relativism in whatever class I.
Mm.
My students will infinitely celebrate technological progress, but they really do not think about the kinds of questions you're raising about what cost does that scientific technological progress, what have we traded away? And at least our national and global birth rates seem to indicate that we have a species wide problem in terms of like we are failing to pass on, we are failing to create the next generation,
Mm.
and
Definitely.
economically it's a very prosperous thing to do to postpone having kids, at least intellectually. And I have tons of friends who have a bunch of kids and somehow no one starves. But if you map it all out on paper, it looks like no one should ever be able to afford a child. And yet, that too seems to me to be a massive sign of like we have missed something in terms of our society, our civilization, that we look at career and we look at social progress and we look at economic progress as total goods rather than potential goods that need to be ranked in their relation to our highest good as human beings.
True, true, true. I think to add to what you just said, one other thing that modernism has brought with it is individualism. It's all
Mm,
about me, myself, and I, frequently, often even within a marriage. So first, you have to be both, have very successful careers, and then you can start thinking about children when you're, in your late 30s, when it will even be more difficult to have children. But then, medical technology, blah blah blah, all the sort of stuff. Um, but it's less. What we are losing is cohesion as a family, as a group, as a well, even as a species, I suppose. I don't believe we are individuals, or meant to live as individuals. We're meant to live as a society,
mhm,
and riches in a society are not necessarily material riches.
mhm,
I recall when I was 18 or 19 and the Iron Curtain had come down, and we could go to Eastern Europe for the first time, and it was in the late 90s, and we would go to Romania. And I mean, I'm working class, but working class in the Netherlands is infinitely more richer than anything in Romania in those days, to give you an idea.
Sure.
And we would be placed at a table, and there were two elderly people. Maybe they were only 60, but they looked like they were 85. And the
Mm,
table was laden with food, and it was me and a friend. And they wanted us to eat as much as we could. And at some point, we realized that they weren't eating. And then we realized that probably what was in front of us was a week's food for them,
wow.
and that they would not have much to eat for the rest of that week. And we were almost felt ashamed, to continue eating,
Mm,
but we had to. We would have insulted them if we had left, a lot of the food. So we ate not as much as we could, but we tried to wiggle our way through it. But realize that those people, they were richer than we were, because
mm,
they had a sense of happiness, the fact that they could share whatever they had. I recall, I recall seeing the man's car, which was a 1950s car, and he opened it, and there were all sorts of wooden parts inside that he'd made himself, so the car could keep on running. That sort of,
Huh.
and then coming back to the Netherlands, I realized how poor my home country was actually.
And certainly, I've not had that experience, but every time I've been out of the United States to travel abroad, I come home just with a greater appreciation for home. That's for sure. There's something to that, being able to kind of see the way other people live, that certainly helps with appreciating the what we have in common, and what's also distinct. Let's jump to a different area. Perhaps not any happier or more positive, but certainly also I just want to get your thoughts on, as a historian of science. We've been talking about science, about scientism, about this way of knowing, and the importance of science, kind of appreciating the model for what it is and not pushing it beyond what it is. There are two areas that I wanted to kind of just get your thoughts on. The first of those is climate change, because just to set this up with a quick narrative, it seems to me that pretty most of the governments in the Western world are pretty unified in presenting a narrative that ecological change or climate change is a looming catastrophe. And there are groups like, particularly the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that produce large reports that have all the prestige of scientific names attached to them, that seem to present this concurrent view. I think particularly politicians read such reports, and they then draft policy and law proposals based on those. Is is climate change an example of rigorous scientific study, or is this an example of kind of agenda driven science pushed beyond its own nature to be used for something else? What are your thoughts?
Or it's a very complicated issue for a start. Let's start with those politicians that you just mentioned. Politicians have no interest in science or what's good for humanity. They have interest in what's good for themselves and the furthering of their career. They are as professional as scientists are. There are always exceptions. So they will pick up whatever gives them votes in the new election, the next series of elections. So if now the next hot thing is climate change, then they will ride that wave. Many of them will. I'm generalizing, of course, but there is that element. So then we have the scientists themselves. It's very difficult to see what motivates their work when it comes to climate change, because so this is how I see it. Climate change is happening. The world is warming up. And there seems to be an involvement of us human beings in there. I happily accept all of these things. The question is, how bad is it? And is the doom the doom mongering, is it well, that already, that word already, is that is it a good thing for a start? Now, I know that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there have been groups who have been warning about climate change, and they were just ignored worldwide. They were being ignored, and it seems that has led to this idea that we have to sort of dramatically increase what we can do to prevent climate change, because so there seems to be some sort of marketing strategy here. I recently watched an interview by this Danish sociologist called Bjorn Lomborg, and he's an authority here. He runs a massive lab in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and he also concedes that global warming is a thing, climate change is a thing, and that there is an influence of man in here. But he says climate change policy can be worse than the actual climate change and the causes thereof. And I thought those were words of wisdom, because there are those who predict that the world we will all burn to death in 30 years or so, and that's ridiculous scaremongering, because even the worst of models, if you like, the most extreme of models, don't show that, but that's how it's being sold. This is the Greta Thunberg line,
12 years, which I think we have 10 years left, if I remember her timeline.
10 years left. Yes. And then the problem is, of course, so how is this sense of urgency being promoted? Well, through the use, of course, of science. And then there is the idea, how do you present the findings of science? And that depends on what you want to present. And we discussed an article over in our email exchange where a particular graph was being shown. And if you have a cursory glance at that graph, you think, "Oh my God, this is bad! Look at the curve of the average temperature rising massively. This is really getting out of hand. We have to do something." And then you zoom into the final 20 years of that curve, and that was, I think, the past 20 years. And according to that same curve, the average temperature rise over the past 20 years was exactly 0. Or something of that kind, or minimal. So the curve flattened, and the way the data was presented was to minimize that, to not show that really, just look at the actual curve. So a lot more data was actually being presented than was relevant. If that curve had only shown the past 50 years, for example, then that flattening of the curve would have been immediately obvious. So we have a problem with the neutrality of that particular diagram, to put it firstly, and then with the science behind it. Well, let's assume for a moment that the science is objective. The science is just reporting what data shows us, because these are measurements. So that's good. That's exactly what science should do. But then the IPCC, that you just mentioned, also makes predictions about the future, and they use historical data to then extrapolate from that and see what will happen over the next 50, 60 years, or what's the most likely scenario. And here we have a problem, because those scenarios are exaggerating what is going to happen. Recently, in Der Spiegel, which is an authoritative German magazine, one of Germany's climate doom mongers, I keep on forgetting his name, but Ramstoff. He was forced to admit that the models that were included in the latest report of the IPCC were wrong. That they were too hot. It's literally what it says in the English translation. The models were too hot. So they were exaggerating the expected raise of the average temperature. And that's problematic, because then science is because this man is a climate scientist, and he had been promoting those models for the past 15 years, and now he had to begrudgingly admit that there was something wrong here. So what's going on? I can't answer this. I can only point out that this is not how science should work, or what science should do or should be used for. Science should be objective, and clearly it isn't.
Earlier in our conversation, you made the claim that there is nothing neutral about science, and it's hearing you kind of just walk us through some of the data and the usages of that data. That seems very clear to me that this is something that is presented as if it's neutral. It's presented with the authoritative kind of sanctioning of this is scientific data, and it's not up for debate. But like all data, it's presented in a certain way, and it's presented. Its data itself is meaningless apart from the interpretation of that data. So the data is presented to cause the reader to draw a certain conclusion, which suggests to me that as we are listening to discussions about climate change, perhaps reading reports or articles about climate change, we need to remember high school lessons about fallacies and about logic, and whether or not the premise leads to the conclusion. And really, that we can't be uncritical receivers of the science, that there's still not the science. There is scientific data that is possibly being used for various ends, but we can't just assume that that then is the whole story. Is that a fair conclusion?
That's a good conclusion, and that brings me back to the role of science communicators, because they are the layer in between that data or those graphs, if you like, that are being produced by science labs, and what's being communicated by the politicians that I began with, and by others who are involved in this. And our education systems should be, and I think this is also what you hint at, to learn a particular scientific skill to our students, namely critical thinking, and do your own analysis. Now, it's not good to be suspicious of everything that's being presented by the media at all times. But when it comes to these grand stories that are affecting all of us and our own personal lives and our families and everything, then the onus, I believe, is on every one of us to do some fact checking. And frequently, with those news reports, there is a source, and that source can be found and can be traced back. And those reports are public. And there could be science papers that can be very difficult to read and to understand. But then we should, make a bigger effort, I believe, because in this case, I want to say that don't blame the scientists when the science communicators baddies.
I think that's a really good caution and word there. It reminds me of a recent story in the United States. I don't know if you're following. You know the name Matt Walsh and the show The Daily Wire. Okay, he is. I figured that would be pretty big, but I am absolutely fascinated to watch what his journalism team kind of uncovered with the Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and their gender transition clinic. And at least since in the month between we first talked about this and today, the Vanderbilt clinic has really shut down what they were doing, and they've said they will not do any more gender transition surgeries on minors until it is settled by Tennessee state law, which I want to try and connect these. I think that was a case of journalists doing their job and saying, here is an interesting story. We're not really sure this should be happening, but everybody needs to know that it is happening. And our political leadership needs to then take whatever action they feel is warranted. And as soon as the Vanderbilt Hospital's actions were kind of brought to light, their donors did not want to be connected with it, and they put pressure on the hospital, and the state legislators putting pressure, and the hospital really backs down from their full gender-affirming care model, which I think may very well be a great picture of what science communicators ought to be doing, in the sense of, like, if there are scientists who are misrepresenting their data for political or economic ends, that's a story that needs to be told and needs to be recognized. So that, which I assume this would work, where that would then equip the scientific community to sort of better police their own, in that sense. Like, nobody wants to go to a big physics conference and be known as the guy who published the really bad data. Like that kind of internal community peer pressure, I assume, is just as real within scientific circles as it is in any other industry. Is that right?
Oh, well, this is a very difficult one that you're presenting. Matt Walsh should forever be praised, and various others like him who are not as well known. I mean, he has 1 million followers on Twitter and I think on YouTube as well, and thank God for that. The modern gender debate or gender ideology debate is a very difficult one. It has so many layers, way too many for us to untangle right here. Political ideologies play a massive role. In the particular case of the Vanderbilt hospital, I think all that Matt Walsh actually did, and Lips of TikTok, another influential Twitter channel, was repost material from their own website. And then they were almost sued for libel. And of course, pre-Elon Musk Twitter banned Lips of TikTok and various other accounts for basically retweeting what was in the public domain. And then thank God that this eventually led to the closing of the particular clinic at Vanderbilt, following, by the way, the a subclinic of the Tavistock in the United Kingdom, which happened a couple of months ago. But I kept on wondering, what the hell is wrong with my field of history of science and history of medicine and science in general, that this whole thing is allowed in the first place? That children who aren't old enough to drive a car or buy liquor can consent to life destroying surgeries, because we're not still talking about life changing. What mental illness is being treated in such a way? Are we telling people with anorexia that there's nothing wrong with their perception of their bodies and that indeed they are fat and they should eat less? But with gender dysphoria, which is the underlying condition here, we seem to do exactly that, based on very shoddy research that shouldn't even be called science, by people with very dodgy degrees, if they have degrees at all. And this is a societal problem. And this is also a problem of individualism versus society, again, something that I touched upon. We have been led to believe that our children know exactly what's good for them, that there is no responsibility anymore for us parents to guide them through adolescence to become responsible adults. We have to give in to their every whim, because if they are happy, we are happy. This is very egotistical. And I'm generalizing now, but it's exactly what's the mindset of many, many, many Western parents. And it's inhuman. And there is an industry very willing to help with this problem by butchering children. And then there are related fields. I mean, drag queen story hour, that sort of stuff. Because pedophilia is now apparently something that's accepted. I'm getting quite angry about all of this. And I think that, yes, this is exactly what happens if you remove the spiritual from your world. If everything is material, then of course you can start chopping off perfectly healthy body parts and encourage others to do the same, and so on and so on and so on. And I think this is a massive failure of science, because there's nothing remotely scientific about any of this. There is an ideology going through this that's, well, as a Christian, I'd like to call it demonical. Of course, that's not scientific to call it demonical. But then I'm not a believer in scientism in the first place.
Which maybe to kind of wrap all that in together, that too is a place that pushes us back to say, okay, so we have a very extreme claim that somebody can change his or her gender, and even to the extent of surgery to mimic the preferred gender. And this is the claim is based on offered scientific evidence. But I mean, I've looked at some of those studies. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's an awful lot of articles that are based on studies of fewer than 100 students. And the most widely raised claim that if someone with gender dysphoria is not taken, if the gender dysphoria is not honored, even in terms of name and pronoun, that person is likely to commit suicide. If you adjust the studies for how many people who are in that condition already have some kind of pre-existing mental health condition, it's literally the identical rate. So what we're really dealing here with is not gender dysphoria leading to suicide and people not taking it seriously causing suicide. We're dealing with people who are mentally disturbed and have gender dysphoria, and that's a potent cocktail for deciding to take your own life. And but I say all that to say that's then drawing bad conclusions off of bad research, which puts the onus back on in the individuals as members of a free society who get to vote, who have all the equipment of education and reason and free discussion. We have the responsibility to then read it carefully, think about it critically, and discuss it honestly. looking for the places where science is being misused and recognizing that for all that science has done, all the goods of internet commerce and connectivity, it also contains all of the bad stuff C.S. Lewis warns about in Abolition of Man, about we have the literal ability to free ourselves from our own nature and to cut ourselves off from really being human. Like we can do that. I would say all the goods that chemistry has done with pharmacology are kind of matched alongside the bad stuff of people cooking meth in their basement and so on. Like all of that pushes back. I just want to go back to your point earlier about that really pushes us back to be very good critical thinkers. And we can't just trust the science. We have to evaluate it and weigh that carefully.
Science is an instrument, but we are the wielders thereof. And we ultimately have to take responsibility for how we wield that instrument. And we have to do so critically, each and every time. That's what I believe.
Well, Dr. Schilt, thank you so much for joining me here today, here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Where can people find and follow your work online?
Where can they follow? Well, there is my blog called Corpus Newtonicum, which has a lot on the Newton that we never knew, the Newton who was interested in the Bible and the prophecies therein, in ancient history, but also his scientific works. You can follow me on Twitter, CJ Schilt, so my initials and my surname. And then if you just Google my name, you'll find a lot of scientific articles and the like. So, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a delightful conversation.
It was. Thank you very much, Josh, for having me on.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Cornelis Schilt, lecturer and researcher in the Center for Logic and Philosophy of Science at the Free University in Brussels. He's the author of Isaac Newton and the Study of Chronology. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.
You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. The Optimistic Curmudgeon is a project of Thales Press. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. You can find us on 3 major social media platforms. Search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon on Facebook and LinkedIn, and find us on Twitter at the handle @TheOptimisticC3. This episode was edited and produced by Madison Kay, audio engineer for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.